A millionaire decides to pretend to be homeless and is moved when a humble waitress pays for his meal so he won't go hungry. The life of a millionaire seemed perfect from the outside, surrounded by luxury, comfort, and everything money could buy. But for Gary, the reality was quite different. He had always been a generous and sincere man, seeking to build true friendships and engage in romantic relationships with the hope of being loved for who he really was. However, he always ended up discovering that the people around him were only interested in his fortune. At first, the disappointment hurt him deeply, but he never gave up. He believed that one day he would find someone who saw him beyond the money. However, the cycle repeated itself. As soon as he realized the true intentions of others, he distanced himself and started over. Gary believed that this time would be different. After so many disappointments, so many failed attempts to build a sincere relationship, he finally allowed himself to believe he had found someone who saw him beyond his fortune. Months earlier, he had met Stephanie, a woman with an easy smile and a charming look who seemed genuinely interested in him. Unlike the others, she didn't ask about his bank account, didn't request expensive gifts, didn't show fascination for the luxury he lived in. Instead, she spoke about art, books, and the simple pleasures of life. For some time, Gary thought that at last he had found someone who saw him as a man, not a winning lottery ticket. Still, even though she never showed direct interest in his wealth, he enjoyed pleasing her. He gave her expensive jewelry, took her on rides in his luxury cars, and to dinners at the best restaurants. To him, it was just a way to show affection, but now he wondered if, in the end, it only made it easier for her to take advantage of him. That night, he returned home earlier than expected. He had spent the day dealing with business matters, and instead of heading to a dinner with investors, he decided he preferred to surprise Stephanie. He wanted to share a quiet evening with her, away from any superficial event or business talk. He bought a special wine, something she had mentioned liking, and went straight to his mansion. As soon as he opened the door, he felt a strange tightness in his chest. The house was eerily silent, and the lights in the living room were off. But there was a sound coming from upstairs, a muffled murmur, interrupted laughter. He slowly climbed the stairs, his heart racing for no apparent reason. Each step seemed to echo in a surreal way, as if reality was about to collapse. When he reached the bedroom door, he stopped. What he heard was enough to freeze his body. Laughter, voices, movements. He grabbed the doorknob and pushed the door open. What he saw on the other side hit him like a brutal blow. There, on his own bed, Stephanie was in the arms of another man. The shock left him motionless. His chest tightened in a mix of disbelief and intense pain. For a moment, he wished it was a nightmare, that his mind was playing a cruel trick. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. Stephanie was the first to notice him. Her reaction wasn't guilt or shame. She merely looked up at him as if he were an inconvenient presence, an irrelevant detail. The man beside her didn't even bother to cover himself. He simply threw a disdainful look at Gary, as if he were the host of this ridiculous scene, not the two traitors sprawled out between the sheets. Gary felt his breath fail, but still managed to speak, his voice trembling and heavy with suffocating pain. "Why?" Stephanie smiled, a cold smile, devoid of any trace of remorse. "Do you really need to ask?" she said, sitting up on the bed and calmly fixing her hair. Gary didn't answer. He just stood there, waiting for something to ease the pain, for some justification that made sense. "You thought I was with you for love?" She laughed, shaking her head as if the idea was absurd. "Gary, you're not that naive, are you?" "I thought you loved me." His voice came out softer than he intended, almost a whisper. She sighed, as if she were tired of the conversation, and ran her hands through her hair before staring at him with a bored look. "No one is with you for love. You're rich, you have status, you have power, but beyond that?" She raised her eyebrows, full of disdain. It was suffocating pretending to be this person you thought I was, having to smile, act like I cared. All of it just to enjoy the luxury, the expensive restaurants, the trips. She shrugged. And you know what? It was worth it, but enough. You were never interesting, Gary. All you have to offer is money. And now that I've had my fun, I don't see why I should keep going. The final blow came without hesitation, without a shred of pity. She then got up from the bed, picked up her clothes from the floor, and began dressing as if none of it mattered. The man beside her did the same, acting as though Gary were invisible. Without looking back, Stephanie grabbed her bag, opened the door, and left. Gary stood in the same spot, his chest tight, as if he had been emptied of any trace of emotion. Her words echoed in his mind like poison slowly spreading, burning everything inside. No one is with you for love. Beyond that, you're not interesting. A knot formed in his throat, but he didn't cry. He just grabbed his coat and left the house aimlessly. The streets seemed different that night, colder, more oppressive. He walked without a destination, not caring about the time or the people passing by. All he felt was an absolute emptiness. He didn't know how much time had passed when he finally stopped. His feet took him to a quieter street where an old homeless man was sitting on the sidewalk, covered by a worn-out blanket. The man looked at him, furrowing his brow upon noticing his somber expression. "What happened, boy?" the old man asked, his voice rough with age. Gary hesitated. Why would he answer? What was the point of sharing his pain with a stranger? But then he realized something. This man didn't know who he was. He didn't see a millionaire, a public figure, someone surrounded by luxury. He only saw a desolate man. For the first time in a long time, Gary felt he could speak without fear. He sat down beside the beggar, feeling the cold of the ground seep through his fine clothes. The words came out effortlessly, as if they needed to be said. "I was never loved for who I am," he began, his voice heavy with weariness. "Every person who came into my life only wanted one thing, what I could offer." The old man stayed silent, listening attentively. Gary told him about the betrayal he had just witnessed, about all the times he thought he had found something real, only to discover it was all for selfish reasons. He revealed his frustration, his loneliness, his feeling of being just a puppet, an illusion walking around that no one truly saw. When he finished, silence lingered between them for a moment. Then the old man gave a slight smile, one that carried understanding. "You know, boy," he began, his voice calm, "true freedom isn't in money, but in simplicity." Gary furrowed his brow, waiting for him to continue. "Here, on the streets, I have nothing. But what I have is real. My friends are with me because they care, not because they can take something from me." He pointed to himself. "Unlike you, I never had to ask if someone was by my side out of interest. I never had anything to offer but who I am, and that's always been enough." Gary felt a shiver run down his spine. He stayed silent, absorbing those words. The old man gave him a light pat on the shoulder before getting up. "I hope one day you understand what that really means," he said, before walking away and disappearing into the darkness of the street. Gary stayed there for a long time, looking at the ground, feeling the weight of what he had just heard. What did that mean? That the lack of money made human relationships purer? Would someone see him for who he was if he didn't have his fortune? He stood up and started walking again, but now his mind was occupied with a persistent thought, something that began to take shape inside him, a question he had never allowed himself to ask. What if he simply stopped being a millionaire? In the days that followed, his mind was consumed with questions he had never dared ask. What if the old man was right? What if money, instead of giving him freedom, was the real prison? If the absence of wealth was what made human relationships more authentic? If he had nothing, would anyone still care about him? The doubt gnawed at him. He began to look at himself in the mirror with a different eye. Every day he saw less of a successful man and more of a fraud. His reflection returned the image of someone who had everything he wanted materially, but none of what truly mattered. He thought about every friend he had, every woman he had loved, and realized that they all saw him the same way, a shortcut to a luxurious life. He felt a knot in his stomach upon realizing he would never know who would truly be by his side if he didn't have money. The idea became unbearable. He needed answers. He needed to know if without his fortune, someone would see him for who he was and not for what he possessed. And one sleepless night, he made his decision. It wouldn't be a game, nor a reckless adventure. He would leave his life behind and live like those who had nothing. Only then could he discover if true connections were still possible. Before disappearing, he needed to ensure his company continued functioning without him. He called Richard, his most trusted partner, and summoned him for a private meeting. "What was so urgent that you needed to call me at this hour?" Richard asked, frowning as he sat down. Gary took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I need time away," he said straightforwardly. "I don't know for how long, but it will be an extended leave, and I won't be in touch during this period." Richard furrowed his brow. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I'm tired." He ran his hands over his face. "Exhausted. I can't keep going like this. I need time for myself." Richard leaned over the table, his expression full of concern. "The company needs you, Gary. This is a delicate time. You can't just disappear." "The company will be fine." He looked at him firmly. "I trust you to keep things on track." Richard remained silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. "Are you really not going to tell me what's going on?" "Not now." Gary stood up. "But trust me, this is something I need to do." After a long sigh, Richard nodded. "If that's what you want, I'll hold things down." Gary felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Now came the hardest part, erasing any trace of the identity that connected him to his real life. He opened his closet and looked at the neatly arranged clothes, the impeccable suits, the luxury watches. Each piece represented a life that, at that moment, seemed distant from him. He grabbed everything he needed and left, driving to a thrift store in the suburbs. There, he chose worn-out old clothes, pieces that anyone would discard. He threw them on the ground, dirtied them with mud, rubbed them on the asphalt until they seemed even more worn out. He grabbed some coins, just enough to blend in among the other homeless people. He left his wallet and cell phone locked at home. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he almost didn't recognize the man in front of him. The elegant, perfumed man had disappeared. In his place stood a stranger, someone no one would notice. The first days were a brutal shock. He thought he was prepared, but the reality of the streets was something he could never have imagined. The cold cut into his skin like invisible blades, penetrating to his bones. The hunger gnawed at his stomach relentlessly, making each hour a bigger challenge than the last. But nothing hurt more than the disdain in people's eyes. Before, his presence was always noticed, whether by status, appearance, or money. Now, it was as if he didn't exist. He walked the sidewalks, sat in parks, tried to ask for food, but all he received were disgusted looks, doors being slammed in his face, and cold words telling him to leave. On the third night, unable to continue wandering, he curled up in a damp alley, trying to shield himself from the biting wind. The hard ground punished his back, and the darkness around him felt more oppressive than ever. While struggling with the discomfort, he began to hear voices nearby. Other homeless people were gathered there, talking quietly, sharing stories of how they ended up on the streets. Some had lost everything due to wrong decisions, others by misfortune. That's when he realized something he had never imagined. Despite having nothing, these people shared what little they had, A piece of bread, a torn blanket, a sip of cold coffee, each thing shared there meant more than any expensive gift he had ever given someone. There were no hidden interests, no disguised intentions, just the need to help each other survive. Observing that, Gary began questioning everything even more. He had always believed that the lack of money made life harder, but he had never considered that, without wealth, people could at least trust one another. There, no one had anything to gain from him. And still, they offered him a place to warm up, a conversation to ease the loneliness. But no matter how much he was learning from that experience, the desire to return to his comfortable life was inevitable. With each night spent on the street, with each day feeling his stomach empty, he thought about abandoning it all. His car, his house, his elegant clothes, everything was a step away. All he had to do was show up in front of Richard and reclaim his position. With a phone call, he could return to luxury and security. Still, he hesitated. He needed to know the truth. He needed to find out if it was really possible to find someone who saw him beyond his fortune. That doubt was greater than his discomfort, greater than the cold, greater even than his hunger. And it was on one especially difficult night that everything changed. The hunger was unbearable. His body was weak and his stomach hurt. As he walked, he smelled the welcoming aroma of food coming from a small restaurant on the edge of the street. The scent of spices made him realize just how badly he needed to eat. Gathering his courage, he entered the establishment and walked up to the counter. "Good evening. I'm hungry. Could I get a plate of food?" The attendant, a man with an impatient look, crossed his arms. "Do you have money to pay?" Gary hesitated. "No, but Then you can leave," the attendant interrupted without a hint of empathy. "No one eats for free here." Gary sighed. He could feel the weight of disdain in each word. He turned to leave, ready to try his luck somewhere else. That's when he heard a firm yet gentle voice. "Wait." He turned around and saw a young waitress approaching. Her look didn't carry judgment, only kindness. "I'll pay for his meal." The attendant stared at her, surprised. "Are you sure? You know you can't just help everyone." "I'm sure," she said without hesitation. The attendant sighed but gave in and went to prepare the order. Gary stood still, in shock. He wasn't used to gestures like that, much less from someone who clearly didn't have much to offer. He was led to a table, and minutes later, a hot dish was placed in front of him. He looked at the food in front of him, feeling a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," he said sincerely. The young woman smiled softly. "No one should go hungry." Those words echoed in his mind as he began to eat. There was something different about her, a purity he hadn't seen in a long time. Determined to learn more about this woman, Gary took a deep breath and broke the silence. "What's your name?" She looked at him for a moment before answering, without hesitation. "Michelle." Gary nodded, letting the name echo in his mind. Unlike many of the people he had met, she didn't seem suspicious nor impatient. Her look remained gentle without a trace of judgment. "Have you worked here for a long time?" he asked, trying to prolong the conversation. "A few years," she replied while cleaning a nearby table. "It's not easy, but it's honest work, and I like it here." He realized there was no bitterness in her tone. She spoke simply, without complaints. It was something rare to hear. The restaurant was almost empty at that hour. Michelle looked around and saw there were no customers to attend to at the moment. Seizing the opportunity, she turned to the manager. "Can I take a few minutes?" The manager looked up from the cash register and gave a brief nod. She pulled up a chair and sat at the table, turning her gaze back to Gary. The conversation flowed naturally. Gary wanted to understand who this woman was and what made her so different from most of the people he had met. There was something about her that intrigued him. Her genuine kindness, the way she acted without expecting anything in return. For the first time in a long time, he felt like opening up, even though he couldn't tell her the whole truth. At some point, after a few exchanges of words and shared silences, Michelle looked at him with curiosity. "And you? How did you end up on the streets?" Gary hesitated. Part of him wanted to tell the truth, to reveal everything, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. He needed to maintain his ruse. "Life gave me an unexpected blow," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I lost everything, and now I'm trying to find a new path." She listened attentively, without interrupting, without questioning. There was no mistrust in her gaze, only silent acceptance. Gary realized he wanted to know more about her. Who was this woman who, even with so little, didn't hesitate to help him? "And you?" he asked, leaning his elbows on the table. "Why do you work here? Have you always lived in this city?" She took a deep breath, as though she had told that story many times, but never grew tired of reliving it. "I'm a single mom," she began, a faint, sad smile appearing on her lips. "The father of my child left as soon as he found out I was pregnant. He said he wasn't ready, that he didn't want that responsibility." Gary remained silent, encouraging her to continue. "Since then, I've done everything I can to make sure my son has everything he needs. I work here all day, and when there's time, I do odd jobs. The salary barely covers the bills, but it's honest. The most important thing for me is that my boy never goes hungry, that he never feels alone in the world." She sighed, adjusting the fold of her apron over her legs. "I'm not going to lie. Sometimes it all feels too difficult, but I've learned that I can't let myself get hardened because of it." Her gaze met his. "I believe kindness always comes back to those who spread it in the world." Gary stayed silent, absorbing every word. As he watched Michelle finish her story, something inside him clicked. He had found the answer he had been looking for. Money truly distorted human relationships, making it almost impossible to know who was by your side out of interest or sincerity. But there, in front of him, was the proof that genuine kindness still existed. She hadn't hesitated to help him, even though she didn't know him, even though she had so little for herself. She didn't ask questions, didn't expect anything in return. She just saw someone in need and decided to act. This was something Gary had never truly experienced. When he finished his meal, he looked at Michelle with genuine gratitude. There was something about her he couldn't explain, a rare kindness, a sincerity that contrasted with everything he had ever lived. "Thank you, really," he said, keeping his gaze fixed on hers. Michelle smiled softly. "I've already said it. No one should go hungry." He hesitated for a moment, wanting to say something more, but realized there were no words enough to express how he felt at that moment. So he simply nodded, stood up, and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he gave her one last look. He didn't know when or if he would see her again. But something inside him told him that this woman had changed his life forever. As he left the restaurant, the cold night air wrapped around him. He stuffed his hands into the pockets of his tattered coat and walked aimlessly, feeling each step heavier than the last. He walked until he found a quiet alley, where he curled up in the most sheltered corner from the wind. There, lying on the hard, cold ground, he looked up at the dark sky and began to think. Everything he had lived through in the past few days ran through his mind like a movie. The unbearable cold, the crushing hunger, the looks of disdain, the cutting loneliness. But he also remembered the unexpected generosity, the bonds formed between those who had nothing, the raw honesty of the streets. And then there was Michelle. She hadn't just given him a plate of food, she had given him something no one else had ever offered, help with no second intentions. There, lying in the alley, he felt he had found the answer he had been searching for. He didn't need to continue with the farce. He had seen everything he needed to. Now, it was time to return. The next morning, Gary woke up before the sun rose. He sat up slowly, breathing deeply, feeling the dampness of the ground beneath his hands. His time there had come to an end. As tough as the experience had been, he knew he would never forget it. He stood up, adjusted the worn clothes as best as he could, and walked out of the alley. Each step felt heavier than the last. It wasn't just the fatigue of life on the streets, it was the weight of the transformation inside him. The man who had entered this reality days before was no longer the same as the one who now left this world behind. With determination, Gary followed his path to the farthest part of the city, where his house was. When he arrived at the mansion, the imposing gate rose in front of him. He ran his hand over his face, aware that his appearance was far from usual. The guard at the entrance, who had known him for years, widened his eyes when he saw him. "Mr. Gary?" The man stepped forward, surprised. "Yes, it's me," Gary replied, his voice tired. "Open the gate." The guard hesitated for a moment, but obeyed. Gary entered, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Every corner of the mansion seemed excessive, exaggerated, as if it no longer made sense after everything he had lived. He went up the stairs directly to the bathroom. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. His face was thinner, his beard grown, his hair messy. He turned on the shower and stood under the hot water for a long time, as if trying to wash away not only the dirt of the streets, but also the pain and experience that had marked his soul. After a long shower, he put on one of his most discreet suits, adjusted his tie, and put on leather shoes. When he looked at himself in the mirror again, he saw a different man. The Gary the world knew was back, but inside, everything had changed. Without wasting time, he grabbed his car keys and drove to his company. As soon as he entered the building, employees looked up but showed no surprise, just relief at seeing he was back. Some whispered to each other, while others simply returned to work. Richard, who was reviewing some documents in his office, was informed of his arrival but showed no astonishment. When Gary entered, he simply closed the folder he had in his hands and looked at him with a half smile. "Welcome back," he said simply, without any big reactions. Gary let out a short laugh. "It's good to be back." Richard nodded and leaned back in his chair. "I knew you would return when you were ready. Just didn't know when." He narrowed his eyes, studying his friend. "But I can see that something's changed in you." Gary laughed briefly. "Because it has," he replied without further explanation. Richard studied him for a moment, but didn't ask more questions. "The company is in the same place you left it. Decisions were made as planned, and everything has followed its course. You can take over whenever you want." Gary nodded. "Great. I'm ready for that." Without saying anything more, he turned and walked into his office. As soon as he closed the door behind him, he took a deep breath and looked around. The environment seemed the same as always. Papers organized, his desk impeccable, the immense window with a panoramic view of the city. Everything was exactly as he had left it. But he knew he wasn't the same man who had sat there last time. And even though he was back to his life, he felt there was still something he needed to do before moving forward. So he returned to the alleys, where he had met the few friends he had made on the streets. Men and women who had nothing, but still shared with him the little they had. He found them exactly as he had known them, sitting on the sidewalk, wrapped in old blankets, sharing pieces of bread and stories of a past that seemed further away with each passing day. One of them, Jason, an older man with a tired look, noticed his presence and smiled. "Well, look who's back," he said with a raspy laugh. Gary sat beside him and sighed. "Yes, I'm back, but this time to say goodbye." The group around them fell silent. Some turned their gaze away, while others simply nodded, as if they already knew this moment was coming. "So you're not like us after all," murmured one of the men, crossing his arms. Gary shook his head. No, I never was, but that doesn't mean I'll forget you. He looked around, observing the faces marked by time and the harshness of life. Then he extended an envelope to Jason. There's enough money in here for each of you to start over, he said sincerely. I know some may not want this chance, but for those who do, it's a way out of here. Jason took the envelope with trembling hands, looking at him with wide eyes. Why are you doing this? He asked, suspicious. Gary took a deep breath before answering. Because you were the first people who really saw me, and because everyone deserves a second chance. None of them responded immediately, but Gary realized that in that moment he had done something that truly mattered. With a sense of duty fulfilled, he walked away and continued on his path. But there was still one more thing to do. That afternoon, he walked back into the restaurant. But this time, he wasn't a dirty, ragged man. He was dressed as the real Gary, a businessman, someone whose presence wouldn't go unnoticed. Michelle was behind the counter, serving a customer, and didn't notice him at first. But when her eyes lifted and met his, her expression froze. It can't be, she murmured, blinking a few times, as if trying to convince herself she wasn't seeing things. Gary smiled slightly and walked up to the counter. Hello, Michelle. She looked him up and down, confusion written on her face. What's going on? She asked, taking a step back. You weren't a homeless man. He nodded. Yes and no. I need to explain everything. She crossed her arms, clearly trying to understand the situation. Then explain. Gary took a deep breath before starting. He told her everything, how his life had been surrounded by people who only wanted his money, how he had always doubted who was by his side out of interest, how he decided to leave it all behind and live like a homeless person to find answers, and finally, how her kindness had shown him the truth he had been searching for. Michelle listened silently, her face still full of surprise. So, all that was an experiment? She asked, with a mix of incredulity and confusion. No, Gary quickly denied. It was never an experiment. I needed to feel firsthand what it was like to live without money, without status, without anything that made me someone special. I needed to know if, without all of that, anyone would still care about me. And then, I found you. She bit her lip, looking away for a moment. And what do you want from me now? He smiled slightly. I want to offer you something you've never had. Security. A better future for you and your son. Michelle looked at him with skepticism. And why would I accept? Because it's not charity, it's recognition. You were one of the few people who treated me with humanity when I had nothing, and now I want to repay that in the only way I can. She kept looking at him, her gaze shifting from doubt to something softer. What exactly are you offering me? A job in my company, an administrative position with a fair salary, benefits, and stability for you and your son. You'll never have to worry about whether the money will be enough to pay the bills again. Michelle stayed silent for a moment. Her eyes began to glisten with tears she tried to hold back. I don't know what to say. Just say you accept. She breathed deeply and after a long moment nodded. I accept. Gary smiled, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. This moment wasn't just about helping her, it was about something much greater. For the first time, he felt like he had found something real, a friendship built on trust, kindness, and sincerity. And so, his journey didn't end there. He returned to his life, but he was never the same. He changed his company, began treating his business differently, helping those who truly needed it. And Michelle, she built a new future. With a stable job, she was able to give her son the life she had always wanted. And by Gary's side, she cultivated a friendship that became one of the most important pillars of their lives. Gary then realized that his journey had never been about finding kindness in others. It had been about discovering a new purpose for himself. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly whole. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.